Hey, I'm Jimmy, and this is Philosophy for Everyday Life. I'm drinking some tea on this lovely Sunday afternoon. I hope you're enjoying it as well. So, today I'm finally going to talk about everyday life. In my first video, I talked about Pierre Hadot, who is a French philosopher who discusses philosophy as a way of life. Then I talked about the idea of the real world and why I think it's an ideology that reinforces the power structures which characterize capitalism in our society. I know that probably sounds a bit complex, so if you're interested, take a look at that video. This week, I'd like to talk about another French philosopher named Michel de Certeau, who wrote a book called The Practice of Everyday Life. Certeau asks how we can resist the power structures that characterize what I've been calling the real world. Certeau writes, if it is true that the grid of discipline, and by discipline he means the social and economic forces that shape how we live, if that grid is everywhere becoming clearer and more extensive, it is all the more urgent to discover how an entire society resists being reduced to it. What popular procedures, also minuscule and quotidian, that is, everyday, manipulate the mechanisms of discipline and conform to them only in order to evade them? And finally, what ways of operating form the counterpart on the consumer's or dominee's side of the mute processes that organize the establishment of socio-economic order? That is a bit of a mouthful, but I'm going to try to explain in this video what he's talking about. He's asking to start whether it is possible to resist the ideologies and larger social and economic forces that discipline our lives. He's going to suggest that we can't totally escape them. There's no way to step outside of society or to step totally outside of the economy, so we have to work within it in some way. He thinks we can do this in small, everyday ways. And those forms of resistance are what Certeau calls tactics. Tactics are a big part of what I want to talk about on this channel more generally. So, as a way of leading into this topic, I thought I'd actually say a little bit more about myself and why I decided to start this channel. I'm currently in the last year of a doctoral program in religion and ethics, and I'm writing my dissertation on three 18th century philosophers, Moses Mendelssohn, Immanuel Kant, and G.W.F. Hegel. I've really enjoyed my time as a grad student, and after I finish, I'd like to teach at a college or university. Before I started grad school, I taught high school and coached soccer for 2 years. But currently, my future is very uncertain for a couple of reasons. The first is that for people pursuing graduate studies in the humanities, the job market has been very uncertain for the last decade. Things have become even worse, as you can imagine, after the coronavirus pandemic, because many institutions, especially small ones that were already struggling financially, are now going to face a lot more difficulties, and some of them are probably going to shut their doors. Many other institutions will increasingly move, I think, toward online courses, which means that traditional academic jobs are not just going to be hard to get, they're going to start disappearing, and many of those that remain are going to change dramatically. My situation is also somewhat complicated because my wife and I had 2 kids during grad school, and then my marriage fell apart. We got a divorce about 3 years ago. Being divorced means that when I look for jobs, if I want to stay in the same area as my kids, I'm going to be geographically limited. Since I won't be able to move to a new location, I'll have to look for jobs where I am. Of course, that means that the job options are going to be even more limited. So, as I've begun to realize that a traditional academic career may not be available to me, I've tried to think about what other opportunities might be possible in this time of change and uncertainty. I watched many of my colleagues create video lectures for the first time during the most recent semester this past spring, and I realized that, like them, I would probably need to learn how to communicate with students through more channels than in person classroom instruction. So I decided it would make sense to start learning how to create content online. This kind of content will likely be a component of whatever courses I teach in the future anyway, so I thought I might as well get started. In times of change like this, it's easy to feel threatened and afraid because change usually means uncertainty. But change is also always an opportunity for new growth. And I think the changes we are currently experiencing call for all of us to dig deep and to reflect on our lives, our values, and our priorities. That's exactly the type of activity for which philosophy can serve as a guide. So today I'd like to talk about how Certeau's idea of tactics for everyday life can serve as a guide during this time of uncertainty and turmoil. So what is everyday life? We could define it in any number of ways, but following Certeau, I'd like to propose that everyday life is the sphere in which it is possible to practice resistance to ideologies, such as the idea of the real world. As I said in my last video, the real world is an ideology that seeks to maintain the status quo. It tries to keep things the same, and it discourages anything which is outside the box. So if we turn to Certeau and his book, The Practice of Everyday Life, which I have here, we could say that the real world is the realm of what Certeau calls strategy, not tactics. Certeau uses the word strategy in a very specific way. He doesn't mean strategy in a general sense, as we might use it to speak of strategy games or military strategy or strategic thinking. Strategy for Certeau is a specific way of exercising power. It's the kind of power exercised by large organizations and institutions. Certeau puts it this way, and get ready for some more dense philosophical language. He says, I call strategy the calculus of force relationships which becomes possible when a subject of will and power, a proprietor, an enterprise, a city, a scientific institution, can be isolated from an environment. So you have this thing that acts, and then you have this environment over here, and the acting thing acts on the environment. Certeau says a strategy assumes a place that can be circumscribed as propre in French. I have a terrible French accent. And thus serve as the basis for generating relations with an exterior distinct from it: competitors, adversaries, clienteles, targets, or objects of research. Political, economic, and scientific rationality has been constructed on this strategic model. So Certeau distinguishes a strategy, which is how the powerful maintain their power, from a tactic. Tactics are ways that strategies can be subverted or resisted. I want to say that everyday life is the realm of tactics, and in this I'm very much following Certeau. Everyday life is the area in which it is possible to exercise resistance against the strategies of the real world. Certeau describes tactics like this. I call a tactic a calculus which cannot count on a proper, this space that belongs entirely to you, or to the actor, a spatial or institutional localization, nor thus on a borderline, distinguishing the other as a visible totality. So for strategies, you have the actor and the other. They stand over and against each other, whereas for tactics, the two are blended in some way. The place of a tactic belongs to the other. A tactic insinuates itself into the other's place, fragmentarily, without taking it over in its entirety, without being able to keep it at a distance. So a tactic, in other words, sort of takes place on enemy territory, if we want to describe it as enemy territory. Whatever it wins, it does not keep. It must constantly manipulate events in order to turn them into opportunities. The weak must continually turn to their own ends, forces alien to them. Many everyday practices, talking, reading, moving about, shopping, cooking, and so on, are tactical in character. Maybe you can start to understand the difference between a strategy and a tactic from these quotations. Here's a more concrete example. Think of the difference between David and Goliath in the story from the Bible. Goliath operates in the realm of strategy. He knows how single combat is supposed to work, and he has a space in which he is accustomed to exercising the rules appropriate to this type of combat. If David had tried to encounter Goliath in the space designated for single combat, and to follow its rules, he would certainly have lost. It was David's ability to use subversive tactics on Goliath's own territory that enabled him to defeat Goliath. In 2013, Malcolm Gladwell published a book called David and Goliath. Gladwell makes a point similar to Certeau's. He writes, "We consistently get these kinds of conflicts wrong." That is, the kinds of conflicts that occur between Davids and Goliaths. We misread them. We misinterpret them. Giants are not what we think they are. The same qualities that appear to give them strength are often the sources of great weakness. And the fact of being an underdog can change people in ways that we often fail to appreciate. It can open doors and create opportunities and educate and enlighten and make possible what might otherwise have seemed unthinkable. Gladwell turns to the political scientist Ivan Aragin-Toft for statistics on how often larger countries win battles against smaller countries. It turns out that larger countries win 2/3 of the time. But then, Gladwell notes, Aragin-Toft asked the question slightly differently. What happens in wars between the strong and the weak when the weak side does as David did and refuses to fight the way the bigger side wants to fight, using unconventional or guerrilla tactics? Aragin-Toft discovered that the odds were reversed in these types of cases. Now, it was the smaller countries who won the battles 2/3 of the time. So we can think of strategies as belonging to the Goliaths of the world, and tactics belonging to the Davids of the world. Tactics are what the less powerful do on the turf of the more powerful, in order to garner small, or sometimes large, victories in unexpected ways. So let's come back to Certeau and try to understand what he means by strategies and tactics a little better. We might ask why he brings up this distinction in the first place. Certeau, like some other philosophers and sociologists, finds a paradox at the heart of modern societies. On the one hand, there is a sense in which we have more freedom than ever before. We have more opportunities for education and personal advancement than were possible in most societies for most of the history of humankind. On the other hand, the level of power that is exercised over individuals in our society is equally unprecedented. The combination of technology and bureaucracy means that institutions and organizations, including but not limited to the government, know more about us than would have been conceivable in any pre-modern society. Our iPhones now track our every movement and listen in on our every word. Not only can our lives be tracked in minute detail, but billions of dollars are spent each year to find better ways to shape our desires, preferences, and behavior through advertising. We are more free and at the same time more controlled than ever before. Certeau is grappling with this paradoxical situation and asking how we can find ways to subvert the control that large institutions exercise over us. What I tried to say in my last video is that this control is supported or reinforced by the idea of the real world. The real world is the ideology of these strategies of control. Certeau wants to know how we can use tactics to subvert those strategies of control. He doesn't think we can get rid of them altogether, but he wants to know, if one does not expect a revolution to transform the laws of history, how is it possible to foil them here and now? I think we can turn to some of Certeau's examples now in order to understand better what he means by a tactic. Certeau writes, take for example what in France is called la Peruque, the wig. La Peruque is the worker's own work, disguised as work for his employer. It differs from pilfering in that nothing of material value is stolen. It differs from absenteeism in that the worker is officially on the job. La Peruque may be as simple a matter as a secretary's writing a love letter on company time, or as complex as a cabinet maker's borrowing a lathe to make a piece of furniture for his living room. Accused of stealing or turning material to his own ends, and using the machines for his own profit, the worker who indulges in La Peruque actually diverts time, not goods, since he uses only scraps from the factory for work that is free, creative, and precisely not directed toward profit. In the very place where the machine he must serve reigns supreme, he cunningly takes pleasure in finding a way to create gratuitous products whose sole purpose is to signify his own capabilities through his work and to confirm his solidarity with other workers or his family through spending his time in this way. Certeau is saying that what in France is called la Peruque, a form of creatively using resources on the job for one's own purposes, is a tactic. This kind of creative tactic is one way that we can subvert the control exercised by the strategies of the real world. In the real world, using one's time on the job in order to pursue one's own projects and purposes might be considered a form of stealing. But in Certeau's mind, this is a bit like saying that the slave who works slowly and gathers discarded scraps of material for his own projects is lazy and dishonest. In a situation where one person or institution has incredible power, it is not necessarily unjust for those without power to engage in subversive tactics. Something like this idea has long been recognized in moral philosophy. The philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas, for example, argued that theft was permissible in cases of extreme need. He wrote, "Whatever certain people have in superabundance is due by natural law to the purpose of succoring the poor. For this reason, Ambrose says, it is the hungry person's bread that you withhold, the naked person's cloak that you store away. The money that you bury in the earth is the price of the poor person's ransom and freedom." If we think of Jean Valjean from the story Les Miserables, stealing bread in order to feed himself and his relatives, Thomas Aquinas would say he was justified, even though the law required that Valjean be imprisoned.
One day I stood in front of a window full of bread. There was just glass between me and not being hungry anymore. So I broke it and took what I wanted. And then they caught me and put me in chains for almost 20 years.
I think we can apply the same logic to tactics performed on the job. If we recognize that the structuring of our lives, and in particular our time, by economic forces and institutions outside our control, results in what we could call a poverty of time, then perhaps we are justified in stealing back that time for our own purposes. We could explain Certeau's idea of tactics in another way by turning to the theological idea of grace. One way of thinking about grace, which in Greek just means gift, is that grace refuses to participate in an economy dominated by exchange or mere reciprocity. Grace finds ways of going beyond a tit-for-tat mentality and entering into relationships and ways of life where one does not demand repayment for every act of kindness or generosity. A world defined by grace would be one where strategies of control or manipulation are constantly subverted by the tactics of giving, generosity, and gratuitousness.
After we searched his knapsack and found all this silver, he claimed that you gave it to him.
Yes. Of course I gave him the silverware.
Maybe the world can never be structured comprehensively using the principle of grace. But that does not mean we should stop using the tactics of grace, however we can, in order to subvert the strategies of the real world.
You no longer belong to evil. With this silver, I bought your soul. I've ransomed you from fear and hatred. And now I give you back to God.
One of the strange things about tactics is that they sometimes turn into strategies. David was just a shepherd boy when he defeated Goliath, but eventually he became a powerful king. I think another example of this phenomenon is the internet in general and YouTube in particular. The internet used to be a very tactical space. It was a way that individuals could communicate and connect outside the normal channels. But now the internet is dominated by large corporations and their strategies, corporations like Google and Facebook. YouTube is similar. It used to be a way that individuals could create content and make it available to a wide audience without having to go through the ordinary channels. In many ways, YouTube still does this. It is still possible to engage in tactical behavior on YouTube. But like other areas of the internet, it seems to me that YouTube is increasingly a realm of strategy. YouTube itself is part of one of the large corporations that now dominate the space of the internet. So now, YouTubers can't just rely on the platform in order to engage in tactical subversion. they probably also need to exercise tactics against YouTube itself. Let me conclude by returning to my own story. As I'm wrestling with my future as a teacher and scholar, one of the resources I'm turning to is Certeau's idea of tactics. I don't have a lot of power at the moment. There are a lot of things outside my control. These include not just what kind of jobs are available to me, but also where I live and how I spend time with my family. But I can still find small ways of exercising freedom, small tactics that create space in a social and economic system that often seems to leave no wiggle room. Starting a YouTube channel is one example, but there are many more that might be explored. So, what about you? Have you found ways to exercise freedom in small, creative, and subversive ways in this very difficult time? Do you have other examples of tactics that you think are worth considering? Do you think the difference between tactics and strategies makes sense? Or do you think there is a better way of talking about how to exercise freedom in everyday life? I'd love to know. In upcoming videos, I'd like to talk about several specific tactics, especially those related to food and agriculture. I'd like to talk about cooking, gardening, and shopping at farmers markets as particularly important tactics for exercising resistance in our society. But before I do that, I'd like to talk about Stoicism. Stoicism has become popular recently among some YouTubers. I think we can turn to Stoicism as a useful way of navigating everyday life, maybe even as a tactic. But while I think there's much to be learned from Stoicism, I think it also has its limitations that should be considered. So next week, I'd like to talk about those limitations. If you liked this video, click the like button below, and if you are interested in hearing more, subscribe to my channel, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.